A Monday morning like any other in New York City, loud, rushed, and indifferent. The F train screeched sharply as it pulled out of 57th Street Station. The sound of metal grinding against the tracks echoed like someone screaming from deep beneath the city. The subway car was packed tight, body to body, eyes glued to screens, ears sealed with headphones, no one speaking, no one looking up. Everyone had their own reason to avoid making eye contact. Near the train door, an elderly woman stood quietly by herself. Her hair, completely white, was neatly tied into a bun at the nape of her neck. She wore a worn beige coat and held a faded canvas tote close to her chest, as if it carried something fragile. No one paid her any attention. She wasn't trying to be noticed either. A few feet away, in a row of seats, a young man sat with his legs sprawled across two spots, headphones in, a backwards cap on, eyes fixed on his phone. The seat beside him was empty. The woman leaned in gently and asked, "Excuse me, young man, may I sit here without looking up?" He smirked and said, "Train's packed, lady. Should have come earlier." That harsh remark fell into the heavy silence. But no one reacted. A middle-aged man with glasses glanced over, then quickly turned his head away. The woman said nothing more. She simply stood still, her hands gripping the worn tote bag tighter. Inside were 2 apples, a loaf of bread, and a small jar of strawberry jam she had just bought from the farmer's market, a gift for her little granddaughter who was homesick. The train jolted around a sharp curve, tilting the car slightly. The overhead lights flickered for a few seconds. The woman stumbled and reached out to steady herself on the metal pole. Her shoulder brushed against the young man's arm. "Don't touch me, old lady," he snapped louder this time, deliberately. A few heads turned for a moment, then turned back, silently, safely. The woman bowed her head in apology and took a small step back. But the story didn't end there. No one knew just a few minutes later a gray-haired man in a cowboy hat would step forward. He wouldn't shout. He wouldn't threaten. He wouldn't need to throw a punch. He would simply stand tall. And then everything would change. At the far end of the subway car, near the door that connected to the next carriage, a man stood, leaning gently against the metal handrail. He wasn't young. He didn't stand out. And he certainly didn't look like anyone's idea of a hero. His name was Thomas Cain, 68 years old, a former horseback riding coach from the state of Wyoming, now living with his wife in Brooklyn. He had once been a true cowboy, the kind of man who knew when to stay silent rather than speak, who understood the power of waiting over forcing his way forward. His back had a slight hunch from an old injury, but there was something about his posture that still felt unshakable, like the base of an old oak tree. The leather hat he wore was well worn, its silver trim around the brim chipped and faded with age. His dark brown wool coat had dulled from years of wind and dust, its edges frayed from too many winters. But his eyes, good God, his eyes still held that piercing sharpness, clear and steady, as if they'd long since learned to look straight through storms. He was traveling with his wife, Margaret Cain, the silver-haired woman clutching the old canvas tote. No one realized they were husband and wife. They didn't stand close to each other. After 40 years together, they didn't need to be near to understand one another. Margaret liked to stand quietly near the door, easier to step off when the station came. Thomas preferred to stand back and watch, like he always wanted to know who was getting on and who was getting off. He had seen everything from the very beginning, the way the young man had claimed the seat, the way the older woman had gently asked if she could sit, and the way not a single person on that crowded train had spoken up. Thomas didn't rush. He didn't react like a younger man might. He observed, he remembered, and he waited. In the left pocket of his coat was a shopping list, Margaret's handwriting. The last line read clearly, "Get extra red apples for Emma." Thomas slipped his hand into his pocket and gently squeezed the folded paper. His eyes never left his wife, and then he saw it. The way the man shoved her, the jar of jam falling to the floor, the apple rolling beneath the seat, and finally the jab of an elbow, not hard, but hard enough to make the older woman's back knock against the train's metal doorframe. The subway car was packed wall to wall, and yet not a single voice rose. A young woman raised her phone, but only to record, not to help. Thomas Cain took a deep breath, slowly, very slowly. Then he adjusted the brim of his hat. No one knew it yet, but that was the moment the world began to shift. Margaret was not someone who complained easily. She had been an elementary school teacher for over 30 years, well used to mischief, impatient frowns, and even thankless days. She had seen plenty. But there was one thing she had never grown used to: the cold, calculated indifference of adults. When Rico's elbow nudged her chest, Margaret lost her balance. Her back struck the metal frame of the train door, and she slid down to the edge of the floor. No one reached out to steady her. No one even muttered a single, "Careful." The subway car felt more crowded than ever, yet she had never felt so completely alone. One of the apples rolled to a stop in front of Rico's shoe. He stared at it like it was a toy. Then, without thinking, without feeling, he raised his foot and crushed it. The apple was crushed to a pulp, red juice splattering across the subway floor like a faint smear of blood. "Oh, wow. You planning to crawl down there now?" Rico sneered, one hand resting on his knee as he looked down at Margaret. She tried to shrink herself, her hand trembling as she reached for the remaining apples still rolling beneath the row of seats. Her thin fingers brushed against the jar of strawberry jam still intact, but scratched and scuffed. "It's just some fruit, lady. No need to act like you just lost your whole damn world," he added, loud enough for the entire train to hear. A girl in a school uniform hesitated, her eyes fixed on her phone screen, thumb hovering over the record button. But she didn't press it. An older woman covered her mouth with a scarf, whispering softly to herself, "Why isn't anyone doing anything?" A young white man in a business suit, headphones in, glanced over for a second, then turned away and adjusted the volume. Margaret said nothing. The sharp pain in her shoulder made it hard to breathe, but the deepest ache wasn't in her body. It was in the indifferent eyes of an entire subway car. Something inside her cracked. From the far end of the train, where the lights flickered dimmer, where people often ignored those who stood there, Thomas Cain began to walk. Not fast, not dramatic, not in a hurry. Each step closed the distance between what was right and what was wrong. Margaret leaned forward, her knees trembling as they touched the cold, hard floor. Her fingers groped beneath the seat, reaching for the last apple as it rolled near Rico's feet. He didn't step back. He didn't move aside. He lifted his foot and stomped down again. Crack! The sound wasn't loud, but in the stifling silence of the train car, it rang out like a gunshot. Something inside everyone flinched. The apple burst beneath his shoe. Juice spilled, spreading across the dirty metal floor like thin, watery blood. Margaret froze, her eyes lifting to meet Rico's, burning with smugness and spite. "You done yet, Granny? Or should I go ahead and stomp that jar too, just to complete the set?" No one stopped him. No one spoke up. A little boy in a blue puffer jacket, no older than 10, parted his lips, then closed them again. His mother gently tugged his arm, her eyes giving a silent warning. The schoolgirl in uniform had now put her phone away. No recording, no saving, no witnessing. A man standing nearby clenched the strap of his backpack, but kept his back turned as if searching for something to hold on to, instead of holding on to the truth that he was being a coward. Margaret staggered to her feet, one hand gripping the metal pole, the other clutching the jar of strawberry jam, as if holding on to the last shred of dignity she had left. Her shoulders trembled, but her eyes still carried a glimmer of self-respect. Rico flopped back down into his seat, legs sprawled out. He looked around the train car like an actor waiting for applause. "You'll see that if you're old, stop pushing your way in. This train ain't a stage for fragile folks who think the world revolves around them. Respect, man. I don't owe anybody anything." Still, no one responded. The silence was no longer indifference. It had become complicity. A blonde girl whispered, "Someone should do something." An older man beside her murmured, "Don't get involved in things that aren't your business." Not your business. To Margaret, this wasn't just humiliation. It was shame multiplied by every averted gaze. She had once taught her students to be brave, and now, in front of her, was a classroom full of adults, and not one dared raise a hand. At the end of the train car, Thomas Cain tightened his grip on the brim of his hat. He was done observing. He began to walk toward the center, toward the place where silence had allowed cruelty to grow. No words, no applause, no one standing up, until the quiet rhythm of cowboy boots echoed down the metal floor. Each step a slow, steady drumbeat, like the sound that signals the end of something. Thomas Cain moved forward, no shoving, no rush. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at one person, only Rico. The entire subway car seemed to hold its breath. The mother holding her child gently tightened her embrace. The young girl raised her phone, and this time she hit record. A man quietly removed his headphones. No one knew who he was, but every eye in that train car was now fixed on him. Rico still hadn't noticed. He was too busy performing the final act of his little show, the victor among a silent crowd. He laughed loudly. See that all this drama over a few apples. Everybody thinks they're some kind of VIP. The very next second, he felt it, a presence stopping just behind him. A hush swept through the car, vibrating faintly like a warning bell. Then a voice rang out, "Pick it up." 3 words, not loud, not sharp, but as clean and cutting as a blade through cloth. Rico whipped around. Standing right behind him, an old man with silver hair, a weathered brown leather coat, thin gloves on his hands, and eyes that burned like embers beneath the shadow of a cowboy hat. "Well, what?" Rico stammered. Thomas didn't flinch. His voice dropped lower. "Firmer," I said. "Pick it up and apologize." A ripple ran through the center of the car. Someone inhaled softly. A woman pulled her phone from her coat pocket and hit record, her gaze unblinking. Rico let out a dry laugh. "Who the hell are you?" "A cop." "Her dad." "Maybe." "What is this? A Western movie? You gonna play sheriff now? What's next? New Age, Clint Eastwood." The entire train car held its breath. Thomas said nothing. He simply took one small step forward, just enough to stand squarely in front of Rico. The distance between them was now barely a hand's width. Rico jumped to his feet, trying to reclaim the upper hand. He raised his voice. "You got a problem?" Old man Thomas stood still, didn't blink, didn't flinch. He looked Rico dead in the eye, and this time, it was Rico who blinked first. Thomas's voice dropped, steady and low, like a heartbeat monitor. "She's hurt. You did that. Now, fix it." No threats, no flexing. But every word landed like reinforced concrete. In that instant, the subway car didn't feel like a train anymore. It felt like a courtroom. One man had stood up, and now the whole world had to face what was right. And from that moment on, the game no longer belonged to Rico. He stood tall, trying to stretch himself just a little higher, trying to clutch at whatever scraps of control were slipping through his fingers like sand. "I don't have to listen to you," he snapped. "She bumped into me first. Blame her for trying to shove in when she's too old to keep up." Thomas didn't argue. He just stood there, eyes locked on Rico. The eyes of a man who had seen more than any punk could begin to understand. The train car felt heavier, as if the air itself had lost pressure. Everyone sensed it. They just hadn't said it out loud. A young man nearby kept his head down, pretending to scroll through his phone. The schoolgirl, for the first time, held her phone steady, recording clearly, without shaking. The middle-aged woman no longer covered her mouth out of fear, but out of shame. Rico glanced around, and for the first time, he noticed the silence tilting against him toward the man in the cowboy hat. He snapped again. "I told you. She deserved it. She shouldn't have stood so close to me." Thomas tilted his head slightly, a small gesture, but it carried the weight of a warning. He spoke, slow and steady. "No one deserves to be humiliated. No one deserves to be hurt, just because someone else thinks they're stronger." A quiet sentence, but it struck like a verdict. Rico froze, just for a split second. "So who the hell are you?" he shouted, clinging to anger, hoping it could drown out fear. "You her dad or something? Who gave you the right to tell me what to do?" "Huh, John Wayne." Thomas didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't move, And then from a row of seats farther down, another voice rang out. "Yo, old man, you got a problem." It was Trey Rico's friend. Bigger, broader shoulders, jacket zipped to his neck. Headphones just pulled off. Trey stepped forward. His face was serious now, no smirk. He squinted at Thomas, then glanced at Margaret. "We're having a private conversation. Best you stay out of it." Thomas didn't turn his head, only a slight shift in his left shoulder, as if his body acknowledged the threat. But his mind remained still, like winter water. The train car went dead silent. A young man nearby pulled out his phone to record this time, with no attempt to hide it. A woman placed a hand on her husband's shoulder and whispered, "He's not backing down." Rico scoffed. "So what now, old man? There's two of us." "You gonna make a move?" Thomas lowered his voice, almost a whisper. "I already warned you." His words weren't loud, but those close enough to hear them shivered, not because of a threat, but because of the absolute certainty in his voice. The train screeched as it curved along the tracks. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, but no one noticed the train's sound. Everyone's focus was locked on a man who didn't need to raise his voice to bring an entire world to silence. This was no longer about a crushed apple or a shove against a subway door. This had become a standoff between arrogance and dignity, between insolence and quiet courage. And most people in that car were starting to understand what they were witnessing. For a brief moment, the entire train felt like it was being pulled into the strange, undeniable gravity of one solitary man. No one dared glance at their phones. No one pretended to sleep. Every single eye was on Thomas Cain. Rico lowered his voice, trying to hold on to his swagger. "You serious right now, over a cheap jar of jam and a lousy apple? She ain't even your mum, right?" Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he turned his head just slightly and glanced toward Margaret. The silver-haired woman still stood, shoulders trembling, clutching her torn tote bag like she was holding onto the last shred of dignity she had left. He asked softly, like breath against glass, "Does it hurt?" Margaret nodded, just barely, only a little. That was all she said. Thomas turned back around. The tenderness in his eyes slowly faded. In its place, a focused stillness, cold and sharp as a winter lake. He stepped toward Rico, not fast, but with absolute resolve. Trey, the broad-shouldered one standing just behind, moved half a step forward, his eyes wide. "Who the hell do you think you are? Giving orders on this train? We grew up in Brooklyn. What do you know about street rules?" Thomas lifted his head. His gaze swept over them both like a seasoned hunter, eyeing two young wolves pretending to be predators. "I didn't come here to teach you boys a lesson. I came to remind you the basics like kindness have never gone out of style." The silence in the train car was no longer one of cowardice. It had shifted into something tense, something waiting, as if everyone was standing at the edge of something about to explode. A middle-aged man placed a hand on his son's shoulder and whispered, "Watch closely, son. This is what it looks like when a real man stands up." Rico let out a bitter laugh, took a step back, then suddenly shoved Thomas in the chest with both hands. No one had time to react. No one had time to stop it. "Thomas, didn't fall. His body shifted slightly backward, but not because of the push, because he chose to step back, to keep his balance. Like an old tree bending in the wind, but with roots still locked deep in the earth. No punch was thrown. Not a single threat left Thomas's lips. And yet, everyone on that train could feel it. A line had just been crossed. The air thickened like the moment right before gunpowder ignites. A young black teen standing near the door murmured under his breath, "Something's about to go down." Trey stepped forward. He stared straight at Thomas, took a deep breath, puffed up his chest and shouted, "We ain't scared of you. You're not a cop, not security. You're just some crazy old man in a leather hat." Thomas didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head slightly and said, "I don't need a badge. I just need to know what's right." The entire train car went silent. Because when one person chooses what's right in a crowd that chooses safety, fear has nowhere left to hide. And that was the moment the third man stepped out of the shadows and everything spiraled into something no one saw coming. No one in the train car had time to react. Not because they were slow, but because the one who made the move wasn't Rico, wasn't Trey. It was a third figure who had been sitting quietly in the dark corner at the back of the car, right by the connector between two train cars. He wore a hoodie pulled low, hands buried deep in his jacket pockets, eyes locked on the scene like a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And in that very moment, Thomas turned his head to look at Margaret. Just one breath, no more. That was all it took. The man sprang up. No one had time to stop him. From the sleeve of his jacket, a baton whipped out a short black club with a steel core slicing the air in a quick, brutal arc. The next sound was thick and flat, like a stick striking raw flesh. Thud. The tip of the baton slammed into the right side of Thomas's head just above the ear. The subway car went dead silent for a beat. Thomas staggered. One foot stumbled forward. His right shoulder smashed into the metal pole at the center of the car, and then he collapsed, his body crashing to the floor like a sack of concrete. Margaret screamed, her voice cracking wide open with horror. The train car erupted in chaos. A man shouted, "Somebody's been attacked." A girl sobbed, "Call for help, somebody call." The man in the hoodie, his name was Lyle, stood tall in the center of the train, face blank, still gripping the bloodied baton in his hand. There was no thrill in his face, no smile, just cold detachment, as if he had done exactly what he'd been hired to do. A woman near the door trembled, whispering to herself. He didn't hit to scare, he hit to break. On the subway floor, Thomas lay motionless. A thin line of blood trickled from his temple, ran along the groove of his forehead, slid down his cheekbone, and dripped onto the collar of his worn wool coat. No one moved. And then everything changed. Margaret dropped to her knees beside her husband, her hands trembling as they touched his cheek. "Thomas, can you hear me?" No response. Someone whispered, "He's not waking up." Another voice, more shaken, "Oh God, is he dead?" Trey, the big one who'd been so full of bravado, took a step back, eyes locked on Lyle. "Yo, man, you went too far." Rico stood frozen, voice shaking. I didn't tell him to do that, but Lyle didn't care. He took a single step back and inhaled as if to say, "See, this is what standing up gets you." A few people knelt beside Thomas. Others stepped back, and the rest just stood there staring in stunned silence at a man who had fallen because he chose to stand up for what was right. But then, a small movement. Thomas's left hand twitched. Margaret saw his fingertips shift. And then, as if summoned by something deep within, Thomas opened his eyes, not fast, not forceful, but enough to prove one thing. He wasn't finished. A woman nearby gasped through tears. "He's awake. He's not giving up." Lyle narrowed his eyes, tightening his grip on the baton, ready to finish it once and for all. But Margaret stepped forward. "Don't!" Her voice wasn't loud, but it rang out clear like a brass bell. The entire train car froze. An old woman who had just watched her husband collapse in front of her now stood between him and the man who tried to end him. Lyle paused, his glare sharp. "Move, old lady. This ain't your business." Margaret clenched her fists. "That's my husband, and he's still alive." No one in the car dared to move. And then a sound rose behind her, soft, gravelly, real. Margaret, Thomas, was trying to sit up. One hand gripped the pole, the other dug into his knee. Blood still dripped down onto the collar of his coat. But his back was straight, and his eyes, they were exactly the same. And with that one look alone, the entire train car understood Thomas Cain was not finished. The subway seemed to hold its breath. A man, blood trailing from his temple, one knee buckled, was rising to his feet, not with strength, but with will. Thomas Cain clutched the metal pole in the center of the car, one hand smeared with blood, the other steady like the hand of a man who had once gripped the reins while riding through the deserts of Wyoming. His eyes opened wider, not hazy, not trembling, but sharp, cold, clear. Lyle, the one with the baton, took a half step back, not because he feared retaliation, but because something in Thomas's eyes had awakened. Something that wasn't made for drama or camera lenses. It was something built for justice. Thomas stood tall, his shoulder slumped slightly, his coat stained with blood at the collar. No one clapped, no one cheered, but everyone moved aside, as if by silent agreement. The passengers parted to either side of the aisle. Lyle growled, "Back off, old man. I told you, get out of my way unless you want more of the same." Thomas said nothing. He just looked at him, and then took one step forward. Now, the distance between them was less than an arm's length. Lyle raised the baton, ready to strike again, but Thomas moved in closer, stepping into the tight space where the baton couldn't swing freely. Lyle swung. Thomas tilted his body, and with his left hand, caught Lyle's wrist mid-air, holding it there. The entire train car held its breath. In a heartbeat, Thomas shifted his hips, slid his right hand under Lyle's elbow, bent it slightly, and pushed upward. Crack! The sound was like a twig snapping, not brutal, but enough to make the baton fall from Lyle's hand and clatter to the floor. A woman in a blazer gasped, tears breaking loose. A young man near the front whispered, "He's not fighting, he's controlling." Lyle recoiled in panic, pulling his hand back, but Thomas didn't hold him. He simply let go and placed one open palm softly against Lyle's chest. The push wasn't hard, but it was precise. Lyle lost his balance. His shoulder slammed into the metal pole behind him, and he dropped, landing like a deflated sandbag. No one helped him. No one wanted to. Thomas stepped back, his eyes scanning the train car. Rico, the first bully, stood frozen, lips pressed into a tight line. Trey, the broad-shouldered one, had backed all the way to the end of the car, his arms hanging limp, eyes avoiding everything. A young woman placed a hand on her chest and whispered, "Oh my God, he hasn't even thrown a punch." A mother gently pulled her son closer into her arms. The boy looked up and asked quietly, "Mum, is he a real superhero?" No, he wasn't a superhero. He was just a husband, a man, and a living reminder of something society had long forgotten. Kindness is not weakness. It's a quiet strength, and it rises only when it must. Thomas turned back, and now his eyes saw only one person, Margaret. She was still standing there, the torn canvas bag in her hands, her eyes glistening with tears. Thomas walked toward her, bent down, and picked up the final apple, bruised, half-crushed, but still whole. He reached out and placed it gently in her hands, as if it weren't just an object, but a piece of his own heart. Margaret closed her fingers around his hand, squeezed it. Thomas nodded. Not a single word left his lips. And for the first time all morning the train car was truly silent. Silent because of gratitude. No one moved. No one dared breathe too loudly. Thomas Cain stood in the center of the train car. No weapons, no shouts, and still everything around him had backed away. The blood on his forehead had dried to a rusty red streak across his cheek. He didn't wipe it off. He didn't hide it, because it was proof that he had been struck. And still, he stood. Rico, the one who first humiliated Margaret, now cowered near the subway doors. His back pressed to the glass, eyes wide, hands trembling. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Thomas took one slow step toward him. No one stopped him. No one intervened. No one wanted to defend someone who only knew how to act tough when others stayed silent. Rico stammered, all right. You win. I don't want any trouble." Thomas said nothing. He simply stopped in front of Rico, looking him in the eye, not with anger, but with calm. And the one thing Rico feared most, Thomas saw right through him. "Do you have a mother?" Thomas asked, his voice raspy but steady. Yeah, I do," Rico replied quietly. "And if someone treated her the way you just treated my wife, how would you feel?" Rico was silent, his lips pressed into a hard line. The swagger was gone. No more excuses. No more comebacks. Thomas stepped back half a pace. Rico exhaled like a man stepping back from the edge of a cliff. But then, Trey roared from the end of the car. The fear in his eyes twisted into the rage of someone too weak to admit they were wrong. He charged like a bull head down, shoulders lowered, screaming, "You think you're tough, old man. You think that makes you a damn hero." The charge was strong but far too predictable. Thomas waited, and just a fraction of a second before Trey reached him, he pivoted, sliding effortlessly to his left. Trey's shoulder barreled past empty air, his balance gone. Thomas hooked his foot lightly behind Trey's heel and with a subtle tug sent him sprawling face first onto the bench. Thud, a heavy sound. No one cheered. No one laughed. Trey groaned, laying sprawled across the seats. No one moved to help him up. A young black woman standing nearby murmured, "He didn't hit anyone. They just fell into their own mistakes." In that moment, a sharp rustle cut through the silence. Lyle, the one who had struck Thomas with the baton, was pushing himself off the floor. His face was flushed deep red. The cold calculation in his eyes was gone, replaced by shame, failure, and a bitter hatred aimed squarely at himself. He roared, "I'm not done yet," and lunged forward like a wounded animal. Thomas didn't move. As the punch came flying, he dropped his center of gravity, slipped inside the arc of the blow, and with one swift motion of his elbow, knocked Lyle's wrist away mid-strike. Crack, a clean, sharp snap. Lyle howled in pain, the baton falling from his hand once again. Thomas never struck. He only blocked, slipped, and redirected. Lyle collapsed onto the seat, clutching his arm, unable to rise. 3 lay scattered. 1 stood frozen. And Thomas just stood there. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. For the first time, the train car understood, together and fully, that they had just witnessed something unforgettable. Not a fight, not a beating, but the quiet strength of a man who refused to let fear dictate his actions. Margaret stepped forward. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes, they shone. Thomas didn't look at anyone else. He turned to her, extended his hand, and asked, "One more stop to go. You ready?" Margaret nodded, and together they walked past 4 broken men as if stepping over discarded ways of living, without needing to speak a single word of judgment. The train glided slowly along the underground rails. The metal wheels clacked against steel in rhythmic echoes, but no one was listening to the train anymore. Every eye, every thought, remained fixed on the man in the cowboy hat, standing in the center of the car, his arm gently around his wife. No one dared lift their head to challenge him. No one smiled. No one kept filming because what they had just witnessed was beyond anything a video clip could capture. Rico now sat slumped, his face buried in his hands. Trey lay on his side across a bench, panting, groaning now and then. Lyle clutched his swollen arm, his eyes hollow and stunned. All 3 stripped of the arrogance, the volume, the swagger they once wore like armor, and the 4th, a younger man who had stayed silent the entire time. Neither joining in nor speaking out, now looked down at the floor, his eyes unfocused, not out of fear, but out of shame. Thomas didn't look at them anymore. He didn't need to. because he had already won, not by knocking anyone down, but by forcing an entire train car to confront the line between right and wrong within themselves. He bent down and picked up Margaret's torn canvas bag. One strap had snapped. Strawberry jam had leaked, staining the inside in uneven blotches. He gently brushed off a speck of dust, adjusted the mouth of the bag like he was quietly mending the shattered heart of an elderly woman he loved. Then he handed it back to his wife. "We still have one apple," he said softly, his voice no louder than a prairie whisper. Margaret took it. Her hands still trembled, but her eyes were steady once more. The subway doors were about to open. A digital voice chimed through the car. "Next stop, Lexington and 63rd. Please stand clear of the closing doors." The mother holding her son leaned down and whispered, "Did you see that man?" The boy nodded. He didn't yell. He didn't hit first. But everyone listened to him. The mother smiled, her arm tightening around his shoulder. "That's real strength, not muscles. Character." Thomas and Margaret walked slowly toward the doors, and with every step they took, the crowd parted without a word, not out of fear, but out of respect. The young man in the hoodie, the one who had silently filmed everything, lowered his phone now. He didn't press a single button. He just watched. The subway doors slid open. Morning light from the streets of New York spilled into the car. Thomas nodded gently to a woman standing nearby. She nodded back, eyes rimmed with red. Margaret gave his hand a soft squeeze. Together, they stepped off the train as if nothing had happened. But inside that train car, no one was the same. An elderly man in the corner whispered, "He reminded me of my father, the kind of man who walked through war without ever needing a gun." A young woman quietly placed her phone on the seat beside her, her eyes shimmering with tears. "No need to go viral. I'm going to tell this story for the rest of my life." A middle-aged black man pulled out his earbuds and for the first time in years placed a hand on his chest, feeling something return that he thought he'd lost his faith in people. The train doors closed. The steel wheels rolled forward again. But what truly began moving that day was the courage in other people's hearts. Thomas and Margaret disappeared behind the brick wall of the subway station, but they left behind something no one could take away, a reminder that sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to stand up, to make the whole world stop bowing down. There were no reporters waiting outside the station, no headlines screaming. Elderly man confronts 3 bullies on NYC subway. No awards, and that's exactly why. The story was real. On the corner of Lexington, sunlight streamed diagonally through the sparse canopy of city trees. Thomas and Margaret walked down the sidewalk. No one recognized them. No one stopped to ask questions. But their steps, though slow, remained steady, just as they had been when they left that train. Thomas pulled out the shopping list Margaret had written that morning, one corner of the paper still stained with strawberry jam from the torn bag. Margaret tilted her head, smiling softly. "Still planning to shop?" Thomas nodded, a flicker of dry humor in his eyes. Apples need time to ripen, just like you. Margaret smiled, eyes shimmering, but not from pain, from pride. They stepped into the small corner grocery store. The door gave a soft ding as it opened. A new day began, as if no battle had taken place just minutes earlier. But deep inside, something had shifted. The city, even if just a tiny part of it had changed because of one man. Back on the train, pulling out of the station, a mother leaned down to her son and whispered, "You see, sweetheart, being strong doesn't mean being loud. Being strong means standing up even when you know you might fall." The boy looked up, his eyes sparkling. "When I grow up, I want to wear a hat like his." Elsewhere, a young woman uploaded the video but didn't use a shocking caption. She wrote just one quiet sentence. "If you had been there, what would you have done? And you? Have you ever seen injustice and walked past with your head down? Ever watched someone get hurt and chose silence to stay safe? Ever thought, I'm just one person. What difference could I possibly make? Then remember this. Thomas Cain was just an old man. No weapon, no authority. But he chose not to look away. And the world had no choice but to stop and watch. If you've ever seen yourself in Margaret quietly enduring, silently hurting, if you've ever wished you had the courage of Thomas to stand up just because it was the right thing to do, then share this story with someone who needs a reason to believe justice doesn't stay silent. And sometimes, one small act is enough to make an entire train car hold its breath. Who is the quiet hero you've met in real life? Or have you ever stood up for someone when it mattered? Tell us. And if you believe the world needs more people like Thomas Cain, maybe that person is already inside you.